It's wonderful to be here with you today, Els. I've been really looking forward to this conversation, also, frankly, a little bit daunted given my own sleep and energy practices, but more on that later. You're an expert, of course, in all things sleep, energy, high performance for business leaders. As a neuroscientist, applying yourself in the business world, you're also an adjunct professor at the IE Business School in Madrid and a keynote speaker and many, many other things. I want to quote something you've written. You say, you dream of making a measurable contribution to a more harmonious society with energetic people who feel good about themselves. And they see sleep as the best way to achieve that. I love that ambition. And you work with some great organizations, including the likes of Deloitte, Booking, Facebook Meta, AWS and Swiss Re, amongst others. So you're really working with the high-performing organizations who I imagine have some challenges in this area. So, of course, we're going to talk about creating a high-performance culture, leadership. This is all about leadership, this podcast, through better sleep and energy management. Welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
Pleasure. So I think we probably all know that we should get better sleep, deeper, in some cases longer sleep. I think that's pretty obvious.
Yeah.
But I want to understand the nuances, perhaps the aspects of sleep management and the impacts it has and the practices in a bit more detail. So, but in a nutshell, just to sort of warm us up and to sort of frighten us perhaps, what are the most detrimental impacts on our mental and physical health from prolonged bad sleep, which is often a feature for leaders, right?
Yes. So, we're going straight for the scary part, I would say, because when you think about, and when you look at the data of what chronic sleep deprivation is what I would call it, does to long-term health, whether it's physical or mental health, it is really scary, to be honest. So if you look at physical health, you can really see that our cardiovascular and our metabolic health suffers, both short and long-term. And the result is that you're much more likely to be overweight, to have type 2 diabetes, or suffer a stroke, heart attack, but also even a dementia or suffer from cancer. So there's almost no chronic disease out there that hasn't somehow been linked to either sleep disruption or, of course, circadian disruption, right? So when we talk about sleep, we often kind of mention them, in the same breath, but on the one hand, you really have sleep itself, but on the other hand, we have our biological clock. And that's where we also often see this misalignment. So it's a really scary list when you look at this physical health. And then in terms of mental health, you see it in many different psychiatric disorders. So we see it in depression, both unipolar depression, bipolar. We see it in anxiety. So it's really quite a long list, or ADHD. And what's really interesting there is that for a long time, we've really thought that those sleep problems are a result of the mental health problems, that you don't sleep well because you are depressed. But now, much more recently, we've discovered that actually often sleep loss precedes the onset of the mental health disorder. So it's really thought to be much more causal.
Well, I mean, I did ask the question, didn't I?
I know.
That's a volley of worry, and I'll talk a little bit of my story later. But this podcast is more about you more than me. Given those detriments, big impacts on physical and mental health, just think about the leaders you work with. You run hundreds, if not thousands, of workshops all the time with these leaders. If it's so obvious, what stops them getting really good sleep or good enough sleep?
What stops people? I think there's just this really big misconception of just how much sleep does for us, and also how much we can gain from an extra hour of wakefulness, right? So this trade-off, I think people are not quite well aware, and because of that make often the wrong decision, especially late at night when our prefrontal cortex isn't quite working as well anymore. And I even notice this myself when I'm up really late. I'll much more easily stay up later than I do earlier in the evening when I could kind of make the sound decision, to go to bed on time. So I think what I often see is that people look at their day kind of as, okay, I need to work X many hours, and then I need to spend some time with my family, and then I want to exercise a bit, and then I just want to have some me time, I've got to run some errands, and then whatever is left over of the 24 hours, that will go to sleep. So maybe some nights it'll be 6, some nights will be better, you get 8, but it's really kind of this leftover
Like a residual,
thing.
like a residual.
It's this residual, and that is really fundamentally wrong. What we should do instead is start with what is our sleep need, and this will be different for every single person. And make sure that you first prioritize those hours, because what you'll see is that everything else will be much easier and much more efficient. So to get the work done, you need fewer hours. The time that you spend with your loved ones will be of much higher quality because you're in a better mood, you're more patient. So things just don't take as long. And I think most importantly, overall, you're happier. Right. And we do so many things in our life because we think that at some point in the future, they're going to make us happy. But there's this really direct thing that can help us feel happier, and that's sleep. So I think it's really about making this mental shift, right? And the way I do that is very much around creating awareness, bringing in the science of sleep, explaining what happens in the brain, showing how people really suffer when they don't sleep well. But the real danger is, and I think that's also why, to come back to your question, why chronic sleep deprivation is so common, is that once we're kind of used to this state of sleep deprivation,
Yes.
it's really
Yes.
hard to remember what it feels like to be well rested. And secondly, we don't see anymore the impact that it has on our performance. So we've seen in many studies that people's performance declines, but if you ask them how they're doing, they A, don't actually feel that tired, and B, they also don't necessarily think that their performance is that bad. So what you get over time is that you don't remember anymore what you're supposed to feel like or what you can feel like, and you don't see that what you're producing isn't of great quality.
That's brilliant. That's so illuminating. It's sort of your rhythm of the day is so based on a view of productivity, being on, delivering. And if you lose an hour or two, it's like, well, I haven't had a great day. Whereas actually you could be doing less and better and delivering more and being happier, but it requires you taking charge. So I'm curious, you talked about the whole series of things from the threat of chronic diseases, which is a sort of shock threat thing, to understanding the neuroscience, understanding habits. In the work you do with business leaders, what do you see as being the most effective nudges for them to move from the, I need to change my sleep habits, to actually doing it in practice?
Yeah, it really differs from person to person. So, the way we started off this podcast, the whole scare tactics, I don't usually use those because most people aren't actually that motivated to change their behavior now by, gloom and doom decades away, perhaps. And I also, I get that. And I do see a shift when people, become a bit older, that they do start to suddenly think about, wait, and this is also about longevity and about staying healthy for a long time. But when people are in their 20s, 30s, 40s, this doesn't tend to be such a big topic yet. And the way they make decisions is very much about the short term and about how they view that. So I think one really important mindset shift is kind of what you alluded to earlier. It's not about working harder, it's about working smarter. And how do you do that? And how does a brain do that? Because at the end of the day, this is about how our brains work. We're not computers. And what we see is that the brain really needs downtime, both in terms of rest during the day, where you take your mind off of a problem and you go for a walk, you get bright light, you socialize, and you come back and you continue to work. But of course, also about this element of sleep. So I think it really starts with taking a step back, looking at what your work requires, right? What does it require to be successful in your role? And very often you'll see that it's all about IQ and EQ functions, and you can just very neatly show how sleep will disrupt those. But on the
Yes.
other hand, how sleep can help you. So if you're working on a problem and you study this problem before you go to sleep, then you sleep, you see that people are twice more likely to find the solution to the problem after a night of sleep. So instead of seeing it as this time taken away from, for instance, work, you should see it as something that will help propel you the
It's like
next
fuel.
day.
It's fuel, isn't it? It's fuel.
It's fuel, exactly.
Mm.
Yeah. So I think that is kind of a big part of getting this mindset shift and getting people motivated to do it. But it doesn't stop there, because lots of people will be motivated after a session and come up with, one or two things. I really limit it to one or two things, small things that they want to change in their behavior. But many will still fail in the long term at succeeding at reaching those goals, right? With any type of behavior change, we see this. People fail at the resolutions for the new year. And a lot of this is about how you set your goal, also how you plan to deal with setbacks and challenges. But it's also about using the neuroscience of behavior change. So that's really something that I've been working more on actually after my PhD, to really incorporate that, to make sure that whatever people want to do, they still want to do 6 or 12 months later, because we see that that is just often where things fail, whether it's about sleep or exercise or anything else.
Yeah, that sustaining piece, whether it's about, the commitments you make or the way you organize, or recognizing there's a degree of laziness inside ourselves and we're not all rational people. I think those are brilliant points. Of course, I was intrigued in your bio and getting to know you. You work with some of the top management consultancy firms, and obviously I know that world very well. Not only the firm I work for, but I've got friends in all the others. And I had a wry smile to myself when I looked at it, thinking, I cannot think of a successful management consultant who doesn't have significant sleep debt. And so in some ways I was thinking that's fertile ground for you. But I was curious, if I was a fly on the wall, I'm not mentioning specific names, but if I was a fly on the wall in those sessions, give us a glimpse as to the conversations. Because the whole nature of management consultants you are, in caricature terms, but not that far from realities, you work harder and longer and more intensely than many other professions. So give us a picture of the conversations you had in that space.
So, I mean, it's kind of yes and no, right? So when I left academia and then I joined McKinsey, and I saw how much we were actually supported in terms of leadership training, stress management training, time management training, all of this stuff, but never ever did the word sleep come up. So that is actually what started me on this path, because I felt like, wait, we're forgetting like the most fundamental part here. And clearly we care very much about client impact, and we care about the people who work here. So, this needs to be a puzzle piece there. And when I started with that, that was around 2013. It was, of course, something where people kind of frowned and were like, what? What is this? But this might surprise you. I was in the Amsterdam office, and people had already organized a sleep workshop prior to me working there. And they were then organizing a new one and asked me to lead it. And that's kind of when everything took off, and I did these all over the world. But there was already, this interest in this topic, and people kind of thinking, wait, this is actually something we should be doing at a larger scale. And I would say that since 2013, so that's 10 years ago, things have changed really, really fast, luckily for the better. And of course, an organization such as McKinsey, Bain, BCG, they can do this really fast because they've got such a fast pyramid, right? So the leaders who were, at the top 10 years ago are not the same ones anymore, at least for the most part, now 10 years later. So you see much younger leaders. And what I've always seen in my career is that the younger generations tend to be much more into this topic of taking care of yourself, being healthy, not seeing work as kind of the end all be all, but being much more focused on balance. And I think that has really helped, not only for me to do my work, because I can just have way more impact when it's a bit more of a fertile ground, of course,
Sure.
but also you just see much more interest and really a change in norms. I remember I once had a project where we would kind of share all of our norms of, what's the thing that you really want to protect on this
That's
project, and
good.
what do you
That's
really
good.
need. And then I think it was a junior partner saying something like, I really try not to work after 12:30 a.m. And I was just sitting there like, what?
Yeah, absolutely.
And I was like, mine is 8 hours. But I made a crucial mistake in the beginning. I would always say I need my 8 hours of sleep. And that was then respected. But sometimes we would have a really late night, which won't surprise you. And then, someone would tell me, oh, you're just coming later tomorrow. But of course, it doesn't work that way, right? 8 hours that start at 10 p.m. are not the same as 8 hours that start at 1 a.m.
Yeah, sure.
So after that, I quickly learned to say, actually, I need my 8 hours and then they need to start at 10 p.m. Otherwise, I just don't.
But that's tricky. I mean, it's refreshing that attitudes have changed and are changing. There's a greater recognition of balance. I guess, and I'm not here to be cynical. It's just the reality of people I work with and know, whether they're in consultancies or senior leaders in corporates, most of them, if not all of them, look and appear and talk about having sleep debt, having some form of substantial sleep debt. Those who don't have made hard choices in their lives. And if I generalize, so they might get their equivalent of 7 or 8 hours sleep, whatever the number is appropriate for them. But for example, for the men, they do no childcare during the week, if at all at the weekend, for example.
Yeah,
Or they
yeah,
outsource things.
yeah,
Or
yeah.
that work is effectively Monday to Saturday and Sunday is for the family. I give you, etc., etc. I'm not here to judge, although there's probably a little bit of judgment in what I'm saying, but there's a little bit of judgment. But effectively, in order to create high performance at work and giving enough time for sleep, other stuff has to give.
That
Yet they
I
don't always
agree
talk about.
with.
Do you agree with that, or am I being
Yes,
too
I mean,
challenging?
I agree with that, right? I think at the end of the day, you can't have it all. But kind of going back to my answer earlier, I think what you'll see is that when sleep is protected, and I'm not talking about 100% of the time,
No,
right?
sure.
I have people really focus on about 75% of the time. When most of your nights are good, I'm happy, right? We're quite resilient. We can have some bad nights.
Yeah.
But if you protect that first, and that's really my mantra, you will just see that everything else becomes so much easier, right? So we can very easily get into this loop of, I can sustain this job because I'm putting in, I don't know, 60 or 80 hours a week. And it requires that. But going back to this chronic sleep deprivation, it doesn't necessarily require that. But what we often see is that people are very insecure. And when you're insecure, it's really hard to say, enough is enough. This is good enough. We're going to present it to the client like this. When you're insecure, it's like, no, let's create 10
Yeah,
extra
that's a very
slides
good
in
point.
this deck.
And it's probably heightened when it's heightened all that anxiety, that insecurity, right? If you are
Yes.
more sleep deprived. So getting away,
Yes.
it's a spiral. It's a
Exactly.
negative
So you
spiral.
have more anxiety, but you also have more of this tunnel vision where you don't really take a step back and say, what's really important here? And if I think back at my time at McKinsey, the best people that had the best work-life balance, but also had the greatest performance. And of course, I was always focused on these individuals, like, where are they? What do they do? Can I work with them instead of anybody else? And what really stands out is that they're really good at prioritization and being
Excellent.
productive. And those two things are way easier when you are well rested. So it also
Yes.
becomes, a much more positive flow. So, I'm sure there's still a ton of really, really sleep deprived consultants and other leaders out there, but I don't agree with the statement that that's necessarily what it requires.
Doesn't have to be that way. Doesn't have
Yeah,
to be that way. So there's something
no,
about taking charge, isn't there, of, as you say, your priorities and then working on your productivity. And then I
yes.
guess there's an inner confidence of saying, if I dial back the work in order to be more rested and to do other things in my life, I'm confident in my own abilities enough and the abilities of other people to do good work even though I might not be the first one to start or the last one at the end of the shift.
Yeah,
You've been
exactly.
talking.
And that's really difficult, right? And I have to say, I wasn't that confident when I was in management consulting. So I didn't have that confidence. So I also had way too much anxiety to stay there for decades, right? It wasn't worth it for me. But the people around me that were really good at it were really the ones who did have that confidence and would be much more easily say, I'm going to close, my laptop. I knew rationally I'm going to close my laptop and I would do it because I knew that would be the way that I would perform better the next day. But, the really high performers, I think, have this sense of I'm good enough. My work is good enough. No one's going to die.
Yeah, I love that frame. I love the fact that you talk about your own feelings as well. I think that's refreshing. Not everyone does. We all put that mask of perfection and so forth. I mean, you talked throughout this conversation about obviously neuroscience and your expertise and background in it. I'm curious about, if you like, the current debates, the frontiers of the research, what is being discovered at the moment, just to give us a glimpse of what we frankly should recognise we don't know about, but also should look forward to. So what are the
Yes.
frontiers of neuroscience when it comes to sleep?
Yeah, so I mean, I go to all of the sleep conferences, sleep and circadian conferences out there, and there is a lot of really interesting stuff happening now that wasn't possible, 10 or 20 years ago. When you look at really large data sets that are being collected, where luckily, finally, more data is being included on sleep and circadian rhythms. And I say this because that is very novel and new. And very often, sleep researchers will just get one question in, right? They can ask participants one nitty bitty question, which often isn't enough. If you ask about sleep duration, you don't know how much they need. So what does it tell you? If someone says they get 7 hours, it doesn't tell me much, right? I'd want to ask a couple of questions, whether it's about sleep quality, sleep need, regularity, etc. But finally, people are getting into this data sets, and that really allows us to, see much better what is the relationship between sleep and developing, for instance, cancer long term, right? Much more detailed than we used to, where you can take into account people's genetics, socioeconomic status, all of this stuff, but really getting sleep. And what we now also see there is that, for instance, with the UK biobank, that some of these participants have now also worn sleep trackers for a week or a couple of weeks. So that really adds much more knowledge to what we already knew. So that's kind of one thing. And on the other hand, I see much more researchers throwing many more measurements together in studies. So one example is from the old lab that I was at Berkeley, where they ran a study with participants who they measured their sleep, but they also wore a continuous glucose monitor. They also really carefully gave them meals that were completely how do you say this, balanced in terms of how much protein they had or how much sugar, but they also took cognitive tasks and looked, for instance, at their performance, but also at subjective sleepiness. And then you can really start to see how these things all interplay, especially if it's a bit more causal, where you can either sleep deprive them for a night or cut their sleep, etc. So I think that's really interesting. And one of the things that I'm really excited about myself is, for instance, these continuous glucose monitors to see, how we sleep interact with what we eat, result in us being productive at work. And even better if we can take into account how often we usually exercise, etc. Because I think where we need to end up is to have kind of a recipe for our 24 hours. And we know this in broad strokes of what sleep should look like,
Yes.
what you should roughly do in a day. But to get much more specific there, I think is really interesting, because for a long time, it was just about what does sleep do to cognition? Okay, and then the advice is improve your sleep. But of course, this is about much more. So that's something that I'm really interested in. The other thing where I think we'll also have many more solutions coming soon is light. And light is such a simple thing, actually, but so critical to our biological clock. And not just to our biological clock, that then impacts how well we can sleep, but it also impacts how well we can concentrate. And that is relatively easy to fix, right? We
Yes.
can have lights in the places where we work. We can reduce light in the evening where we live. So those are things that kind of help us, I would say, almost kind of go back in time to the way, we used to live. And
Yes.
not to say that everything back in the day was good or healthy, but it is clear that our brain needs certain things and expects certain things, such as really bright light during the day and really dim light in the
Yeah.
evening.
Well, given the energy crisis, we probably should start using candles more at night. That will probably bring us back.
Yes.
A serious point with a slight smile. I'm not decrying the impact of that crisis on many of us. It's interesting you talk about all these aspects. I mean, in fact, you're trying to look for the recipe with all the ingredients for more than just a high performing work experience, but a high quality life. Because
Yes.
there's part of me thinks, I have a number of reactions. I think one, gosh, that feels very structured, very regimented. Gosh, that could be very narrow. But actually, that feeling is pushed out quite quickly by actually, there's lots of small choices we can all make as individuals because we have our preferences, but there are principles that we should use. And the fact that it's all integrated, if you have the obvious ones being, too much caffeine, too much sugar effects, we know that. But I guess what you're referring to is a deeper appreciation of perhaps meal composition, timing, frequency, and so forth.
Yeah.
That's brilliant. And it's sort of these sorts of aspects, I guess, are more commonly applied in elite sport.
Yes. Yeah. So it's interesting that you mentioned that, because it's actually really hard to find the science that is focused on healthy individuals who don't have insomnia or any other sleep disorder. And this is also due to, funds. They tend to go to diseases. They tend to not go to anything that's just about, living healthy, even though, of course, we could save so much by people preventing diseases. But some of the most informative research is being done on athletes. So, there is funding to do that work, and that's where we can kind of draw these conclusions. So I think this field really needs to grow. I'm actually hosting a session on this in the next big sleep conference, because I feel like, there's a much bigger group of people that don't suffer from a sleep disorder, but that, as you and I know, don't necessarily sleep. I wouldn't even say perfectly, but don't even sleep, nearly as kind of, normal. But what are little things that they can do, right?
Yes.
We
Yes.
don't want to come up with this, every minute of the day, this is what you need to do. That will never happen. People will never live like that. But what are these quick wins where if you just, change one or two things,
Yes.
you can
Yes.
notice a difference, you can make it a habit, and you live happier and longer ever
That
after.
framing you've talked about throughout, which is around the benefits of a better, happier, healthier life, and being realistic about the likelihood of changes, and being the fuel for great performance, great impact professionally and personally. That's what it's got to be, because I think sometimes it can go into this nirvana of perfection. You must
Yes.
do this and so forth, or it's considered that residual of, look, you're not really committed if you have enough sleep. You really got to push yourself hard. I'm curious about you. Obviously, you've been very open and honest, and it's refreshing, because I guess you get a lot of people thinking, "Oh, you must be this perfect on all of these things," and you said you're
No.
not. Based on your research and your work with business leaders over many years now, what are the practical changes that you've made based on the research and practice?
Yeah. So I'll start off by saying that I think that what everybody, is kind of best suited to do will be different for every
I
individual.
understand that. Yeah.
Right. So for insomniacs, will be very different than for people who are basically just not getting enough sleep. Right. To give you a very specific example, people who are just not getting enough sleep, take naps. Naps are great. People with insomnia, don't take naps, actually, spend even less time in bed. That has been shown to be much more impactful. So it's very hard to give, kind of
No,
a
I understand.
blanket statement advice. But what I really live by, and everybody who knows me can attest to that, is that I just really prioritize sleep, and not every single night. I mean, 2 weekends ago, I had a weekend in Paris with my friends where, suddenly I was staying up late, drinking alcohol, which I hardly ever do, having really late night meals, sleeping in,
You were
so
rebelling. You were rebelling against the system,
exactly.
and being, well, good for you. Good for you.
But I will say, most of the time, going back to the 75% of the nights, I do prioritize sleep. And it's funny sometimes, the situations it creates. So, for instance, my parents who were staying over with us last weekend, they go to bed later than I do, and they kind of roll their eyes when I'm like, I'll have an alcohol-free beer, or can we have dinner early? But I just don't like it. I don't like it.
So when do you go to bed? What time do you go to bed? To sleep.
So around 9 p.m., I'll kind of get into this mode of, okay, I should probably, get moving or finish some things, or, maybe watch 10 more minutes of TV or whatever. And then I get ready for bed, have my routine. And when I'm in bed, I always write in my journal. That's something I actually started during Corona, which kind of started more as a gratefulness journal. And now it's kind of, kind of the combination of writing down any worries, any thoughts that I have, as well as, good things that happened in the day. And it just really helps me fall asleep after. And I would say, I think, and I can also check this, of course, with the sleep trackers, I think I usually fall asleep a little bit before 10 p.m. I'm also a morning type, right? So this time will be very different for an evening type, but
Sure,
for
sure.
me, that's definitely ideal. And I also have little kids that will always wake up between 6 and 7 a.m. So I just want to, be ready when they wake up, and also not be cranky when they wake up, because
Good
when
for
I have
you.
gone to
Good for
bed
you.
late, I do get cranky when they wake up and think, oh my God, not now. Yeah.
Good for you. Good for you. And I mean, you talked about some of the habits, I mean, your own habits in terms of that fuel your best time with your kids as well as your at work. Let's talk a bit broader. I mean, you've given a sense of your purpose, what you're doing in your work, and I think it's brilliant, clearly brilliant work. How do you describe the impact you want to have on the world around you?
Mm. So I guess I would feel that I've kind of, accomplished things when people have changed their mindset around seeing sleep not as this waste of time, but seeing it as this, really valuable thing that, yeah, maybe you'd want to prioritize about 75% of the time, and then, have some parties, etc. the other days. But that they then also know what is really scientifically proven as a good approach for me to make a change. Going back to, being realistic about behavior change, they're not going to change 10 different things. So I would want them to know what are kind of the one or two things that will have the biggest impact for them as an individual.
Yes, yes,
And I see this, as a lifelong challenge, right? Maybe right
mm,
now you're prioritizing these one or two things. And I even see this in my own life, right? Writing in the journal, I wasn't doing that when I had, tiny little kids, because I would be busy with them and, just kind of be so tired right before I went to bed. So it will really depend on your life, the stage of life that you're in, what you're focused on specifically. So I think it's about people having easy access and kind of learning how to do this. And I focus on this with companies because I feel that companies have such, are positioned so well to
yes,
help people with this,
yes,
particularly
absolutely.
people, who don't necessarily have a sleep disorder, but who, could really benefit from sleeping better. They're not going to search for a sleep app out there. They're not going to go on websites or whatever. So it helps if you receive this in your corporate training, the way I, received other things when I was back at McKinsey. So it's about helping people, but of course also changing culture, right? There's still so many companies that don't
Yes.
appreciate,
Yes.
and so many leaders that don't
And
appreciate the
talking
value.
openly about it. It's that conversation on what do you need to do your best work, and sleep,
Yeah,
in many cases should be integral to that conversation, as opposed to that sort of luxury. Oh,
yeah,
you get that the weekend when you can recover type conversation that I was
yeah.
party to on many, many, many occasions. Else,
Oh, a final point, which I think
yes,
is really
yeah,
important to mention, is that sleep isn't available as easily for everyone in this world, and I think we see more and more research really showing this, that if you're in the lower socioeconomic status, it is much harder to get good sleep. A bit similar to that, it's much harder, to eat really healthy if you don't have
yes,
that much money to spend on vegetables, etc. We see the same thing with sleep, whether it's because people have to work night shifts, work multiple jobs, have long commute to their work, or really irregular shifts. But also the areas in the world that have much more light pollution at night, or much more noise in the middle of the
yes,
night.
yes,
So I think that's really something that we need to become much more aware of. That when we talk about leaders, of course, a lot is within their control, and they
yeah.
have the money to buy the
Like a
latest
first
sleep
world
gadget
problems they
or a
have.
good
Yeah,
light. But I hope that these leaders, once they become aware of it, also think about all the blue collar workers in their
that's a
organizations,
really good
and
point.
whether they're supporting their sleep as well.
That's a really, really good point. Also, what a stimulating, enriching conversation. I love
Thank
the
you.
clarity of what you say, the quality of your insights, and the humanity that you show as well, which has felt very real. I mean, it's been a bit of a wake up call for me, pun intended, because of my. I'm not a role model in this space. And
Mhm.
I haven't seen any particular, I'm aware of mental health issues associated with lack of chronic lack of sleep. But physically, I put on a bit of weight, which I hadn't anticipated, and a few other minor things. But, for probably 10 years, I've had, until the last month, interrupted sleep every single night for at least an hour between two
Oh,
and
wow.
four, because my son, who has brain damage, gets up. And we faced some difficult choices. Do you medicate him?
Mhm.
And we said no. We could have shared it out between my wife and me, and that's for another podcast on marriage counselling, which we're not going to talk about today. But and I frankly would work late, because from about 7:30 to 1 to I knew that he was going to be asleep. And so I go to bed
Mhm.
very late, and I'm very productive in that space.
Yeah.
I think what I've taken from my research into what you do and this conversation is something at some point is going to go wrong. And secondly, I think probably I've got to trust and be confident in my abilities to do fewer hours and do them better. And frankly, get a grip, Lancefield, as my mum would say to me. So I'm grateful for your stimulus, your implicit nudges, and I know many other people will be too. Where can people find out more about your brilliant work, Els? Where can they find you online?
Yeah, so my own personal website, which is elsvanderhelm.com. It's just my name.com. And I also post regularly on LinkedIn about the latest science and insights and news around sleep, and sharing tips
Yes,
there.
you're brilliant on that. You're very, very stimulating thoughts, as you've shown in this conversation today. So thank you for today. That was another edition of Lancefield on the Line. I do hope you enjoyed this episode as much as I did. Please do check out the other episodes in the series. Sign up to the YouTube channel and to the podcast, and give us a wonderful rating. Else, thank you ever so much again.